This is Land of Havilah, Matthew 26c. A multitude with swords and clubs, sent out by the chief priests and elders of the people, guided by Judas, arrested Jesus. Verse 56 said all the disciples left him and fled, but that was sort of a generalization. As we're about to learn, Peter followed from a distance. Also, according to the Gospel of John, another unnamed disciple followed, John 18, 15, and 16. The best guess is that was John himself, and he didn't want to brag about it by naming himself. Also, another young man followed and got a little too close. The officers grabbed him by the linen garment he was wearing, but the young man pulled out of it and escaped naked. Mark 14:52. No one else stood up for Jesus enough to be arrested, so in that sense they all fled. Now what did they do with Jesus? Verse 57. Those who had taken Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter followed him from a distance to the court of the high priest, and entered in and sat with the officers to see the end. Comment: there were two high priests at that time. They took Jesus to Annas first, John 18, 13-34. Annas questioned him, and when one of Jesus' answers wasn't respectful enough in the opinion of one of the guards slapped him. Annas sent him bound to the other high priest, Caiaphas. Jesus told Peter in verse 34, "Most certainly I tell you that tonight before the rooster crows you will deny me 3 times." In verse 58, Peter followed at a distance. He gained entry to the outdoor courtyard of the high priest and stood there and sat there with some of the servants and officers of the high priest, John 18:16, to see what the outcome would be in verse 58. As to the events inside, verse 59, now the chief priests, the elders, and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, and they found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said to him, "Have you no answer? What is this that these testify against you?" But Jesus held his peace. The high priest answered him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it. Nevertheless, I tell you, after this you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of the sky." Then the high priest tore his clothing, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Behold, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered, "He is worthy of death." Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ, who hit you?" Comment: in verse 59, it was a kangaroo court and a fishing expedition. It was a kangaroo court because they knowingly used false witnesses, and it was a fishing expedition because there was no charge against him. They were fishing for a charge, and it had to be a charge punishable by death. In verse 60, there were many false witnesses, but they weren't getting anywhere because they contradicted each other. Mark 14:56. In verse 60, finally 2 witnesses agreed on something, but it wasn't very much criminal, more a sign of lunacy, that he had said, "I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days." But as weak as the charge was, even that was inaccurate. He didn't say he would destroy the temple. He said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," John 2:19, meaning that when they would destroy the temple of his body, he would raise his body up in 3 days, John 2:21. In verse 63, when they asked Jesus what he had to say about destroying and rebuilding the temple, he said nothing. Here's why. He told his disciples that whenever they would appear before the authorities, quote, "I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to withstand or contradict," Luke 21:15. Therefore, if Jesus had answered, he could have freed himself, and the crucifixion wouldn't have happened. But the crucifixion had to happen, John 12:27 and Luke 24:7, so he kept quiet. Eventually they got what they wanted in verse 63 when the high priest adjured him by the living God to answer whether he was the Christ. Under the law of Moses, Jesus had to give an answer in respect for the high priest, Deuteronomy 17:12. So he answered. The first part of the answer in verse 64 was, "You have said it," meaning you came up with the idea on your own that I was the Christ. You didn't get it from me. From time to time, Jesus did admit that he was the Christ, but only in safe situations such that it wouldn't get back to the authorities. But they suspected he was the Christ anyway because of his signs. They said, quote, "What are we doing, for this man performs many signs?" John 11:47. Their attitude was that if he was the Christ, they just wanted to keep their minds shut to the idea. The second part of Jesus' answer about whether he was the Christ was, "I tell you, after this you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of the sky." End quote. This was a reference to his return on the day of the Lord at the end of the tribulation, when he'll come in power and great glory, Matthew 24:30. All the council would be in their graves by then, but they would somehow be conscious on the other side of the grave to see it happen, because Jesus said, "You'll see it." In verse 65, they all agreed in an uproar that it was blasphemy, which called for death, Leviticus 24:16. Bottom line, they convicted him for claiming to be the Christ, the Messiah, and of that he was guilty. Back in the courtyard, verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside in the court, and a maid came to him, saying, "You were also with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." When he had gone out onto the porch, someone else saw him and said to those who were there, "This man also was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it with an oath, "I don't know the man." After a little while, those who stood by came and said to Peter, "Surely you are also one of them, for your speech makes you known." Then he began to curse and to swear, "I don't know the man." Immediately the rooster crowed. Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." He went out and wept bitterly. Comment: Peter was the most vocal disciple, saying he'd go to death before he would deny Jesus. But in the familiarity of the courtyard and trying to blend in, he couldn't stay faithful. He got trapped before he said anything, as soon as he determined in his mind that he would try to blend in. Peter heard Jesus say back in Galilee, "Everyone therefore who confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven." Matthew 10:32 and 33. He also heard Jesus say, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its flavor, with what will it be salted? It is then good for nothing, but to be cast out and trodden under feet by men." Matthew 5:13. In denying Jesus, Peter tried to save himself from scorn, but the scorn only got worse. After 3 witnesses identified him, everybody knew it was true, and on top of scorn for being with Jesus, there was scorn that he was a coward. So he was cast out and trodden underfoot by men because his salt lost its flavor. He'll be a different person in Acts chapter 2 when he receives the baptism of the Holy Spirit and power from on high. Luke 24:49. Quote, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you." Acts 1:8. Instead of deniers, quote, "You will be witnesses to me." End quote. Jesus was strong in admitting that he was the Christ because the Father made him strong that way. As prophesied in Psalm 80, verse 17, Jesus prayed, quote, "Let your hand be on the man of your right hand, on the Son of Man, whom you made strong for yourself." End quote. Father, make us strong. Matthew 27 is next at landofhavilah.net. Matthew 27.